My mother covered every container of water in our house before she went to sleep. Every single one. Not most nights. Every night. No exceptions, no shortcuts. The big yellow bucket in the bathroom. Covered. The pot left soaking in the sink. Covered. The glass someone had left on the kitchen counter. Covered. The smaller vessels, the ones you would forget about if you weren't paying attention, she didn't forget. She moved through the house the way water moves, finding every low place, leaving nothing open. And as she covered each one, she murmured something. Low, under her breath. Quiet enough that you couldn't make out the words unless you were right beside her. And even then, it was barely audible. Something between a prayer and a command. Something that seemed to belong entirely to her. I was 12 years old the first time I noticed the full ritual. I watched her move from the bathroom to the kitchen, to the small storage room off the back, covering and murmuring, with this unhurried deliberateness, this complete absence of self-consciousness. And I remember the feeling in my chest very clearly. Embarrassment. Not for myself. For her. Which is, I have come to understand, the most corrosive kind. The embarrassment that travels outward from the embarrassed person and settles on someone else, as though their certainty is the problem. As though being certain about something unverifiable is a character flaw. My father, who lectured in the history of ancient religions at University College London, and who had a particular gift for making observations that felt generous while landing like dismissals, called it Nigerian hygiene anxiety. He said it with warmth. He said it with the affection of someone who loved her and simply didn't share her framework. And I absorbed that framing the way you absorb weather. Without choosing it. Without examining it. Without noticing that I had made a very specific decision about my mother and dressed it as neutrality. I was at the School of Oriental and African Studies by then, ZOAS in London, studying ancient Near Eastern languages, reading Akkadian cuneiform, building the kind of academic credentials that feel at 19 like a form of liberation from the provincial and the superstitious. I understood the traditions. I could read the texts in their original languages. I had learned to hold ancient material at a certain controlled distance, to analyze it without being inhabited by it. My mother had no such distance. She was inhabited by what she knew. And every night, before bed, she covered the water. A quick pause before I go further. This channel exists for exactly this kind of conversation. The one where a manuscript says something your grandmother already knew, and suddenly the distance between the academic and the ancestral collapses. If that resonates with you, the subscribe button tells the algorithm you want more of this. And I have far more of these than I will ever be able to sleep through. My mother died in 2011. I was 43 years old. And that sound, the quiet thud of a lid being placed on a container, the small scrape of cloth being drawn over the mouth of a glass, stayed with me. Not as a memory I retrieved when I tried. As a presence. Something that was just there, below the level of language in the chest, available without effort. I told myself it was grief, that I was romanticizing a detail because the detail was all I had left of her evenings. But there was a second thing underneath that explanation. Something I kept noticing and then looking away from. I had spent 20 years working with ancient Near Eastern texts, Talmudic commentaries, apocryphal manuscripts, Solomonic literature, Kabbalistic protective traditions, Ethiopian Orthodox theological texts. And over those 20 years, I kept encountering the same question, threading through very different conversations, surfacing in the margins of very different arguments. What passes through open water at night? And why did every ancient civilization care so much about closing it? I noticed this, the way you notice a thread repeating in a tapestry. The first time, you think it's coincidence. The third time, you recognize the pattern. The seventh time, you begin to think the tapestry was designed around it. And then, my mother was gone, and I could no longer ask her what she was saying when she covered the water. But the manuscripts were still there. 6 years after she died, I found the answer somewhere I wasn't looking for it. The specificity matters here, and I want to be exact about it. It was a Thursday afternoon in late October. Gray light coming through the high windows of the British Museum reading room. I was there to finish research on a paper about Solomonic amulet traditions. Specifically, I was tracing the chain of transmission from the biblical Solomon through to the Talmudic period and into the later manuscript tradition. Dry, technical, historical work. The kind that requires good lighting and far too much coffee. To follow one particular thread in the amulet tradition, I needed to cross-reference material in the Babylonian Talmud. The tractate Bava Kamma on damages. Primarily civil law, liability, property disputes, inheritance questions. Not exactly spiritual warfare territory, but the digital scan I pulled up wasn't on the page I expected. I was in Bava Kamma 115b instead of 110, and I was about to page forward when a phrase stopped me. Stam mayim. Uncovered water. I read the sentence. Then I read it again. The rabbis were arguing about legal liability. Very practical civil law questions about who bears responsibility when someone is harmed. And woven into that discussion as though it were the background assumption that everyone in the room already shared, as though this were simply how the world worked. Uncovered water at night is dangerous because of the shedim. The shedim, the demons, the Babylonian Talmud, compiled over centuries by rabbis working in the 500s of the Common Era, preserving oral traditions that stretched back through the Second Temple period. Traditions the rabbis themselves attributed to the Solomonic era was treating the covering of water at night as basic household protection against spiritual entities, not as metaphor, not as a relic of pre-rational thinking that had persisted through inertia and hadn't been refined out yet, as legal code, as a household protection requirement considered important enough to encode into Jewish civil and religious law alongside inheritance rules and property boundaries. I sat back in my chair. I thought about my mother and her yellow bucket. And then I thought, I need to understand how deep this goes. The paper did not get finished that week. I went back to the primary sources. Gittin 68 first. The Talmudic tractate where Solomon appears directly. This is the key rabbinic text on Solomon and Asmodeus, the king of the demons, and it is the most direct documentation we have of Solomon's systematic theology of spirit management. Solomon didn't command spirits randomly or reactively. He had a structured understanding of how they moved, where they gained access, what blocked them, what opened paths for them. The architecture of his protective system was the architecture of sealing, sealed vessels, closed access points. The seal of Solomon was not just a symbol. It was the concentrated expression of a theology. A contained system could not be breached. An open one was a door, and an open door at the wrong time in the wrong conditions was an invitation that something would accept. Covering water at night was not a folk practice that happened by accident to end up in the legal code. It was the domestic application of Solomonic containment theology. The rabbis encoded it in civil law because Solomon had established it as spiritual truth, and the rabbis understood preserving what Solomon knew as part of their core responsibility. So I had a Solomonic source, and I had a Talmudic source that was explicitly Solomonic in its origin. But here is where I almost stopped, where I came very close to closing the file and telling myself I had one interesting footnote and nothing more. Because I said to myself, this is one tradition. Judaism, Talmudic scholarship, and the Solomonic manuscript tradition are not three independent witnesses. They are the same civilization looking at itself across different centuries. Yes, the instruction is clear. Yes, it's traceable to Solomonic wisdom. But one tradition preserving itself across time is not the same thing as convergence. It is coherence. That's a different thing. For genuine convergence, I needed a second civilization that had arrived at the same behavior independently, a tradition that had never read the Talmud, never encountered the Solomonic manuscript record, never had access to Gittin 68, and had nonetheless arrived at the same instruction with the same rationale by its own path. I spent 3 weeks working through comparative household protection practices across the ancient Near East. I was looking for the covering instruction in Babylonian or Assyrian sources, in early Egyptian material, in Canaanite texts. I found proximate things. Water as spirit domain appeared consistently. The vulnerability of open thresholds at night was a Near Eastern constant. But I did not find the specific domestic nighttime instruction. Cover the vessels of water before you sleep. There was one dead end in particular that I remember, because it felt so close. The Mesopotamian Lamastu tradition. The Assyrian and Babylonian texts about the demoness Lamastu, who was associated with water, with nocturnal entry, with threatening sleeping households, seemed promising. Lamastu was repelled by specific protective measures. But when I traced those measures, they were amulets and incantations, not the covering of vessels, not the sealing of water containers. The Mesopotamian tradition pointed to the same spiritual concern, but arrived at a different solution. It was a related language, but not the same sentence. I also went through the early Egyptian protective literature, the texts from the coffin texts period through to the late period household protection papyri. Again, water was present as a domain of spiritual power. The river Nile as sacred and dangerous, the night as a time when the dead moved, the threshold as a liminal point. But the specific instruction to cover water containers at night, with the specific rationale that something uses the open surface as an entry point, I didn't find it. Or at least, not in the form I was looking for. I was tired. My paper deadline had passed, and I had emailed my editor an explanation that I am not proud of. I was starting to tell myself that what I'd found was genuinely interesting, but essentially a single tradition phenomenon, a feature of the Solomonic and Talmudic world without a wider resonance. I almost convinced myself. That's the honest version. And then, in the course of a completely different project, I found Sahih Muslim Hadith 2012. I was working through a comparative study of household protection practices across the Abrahamic traditions, filling in a table, essentially. And I reached the Islamic material almost mechanically, because the comparative methodology required it. The Prophet commanded, cover vessels, tie up water skins, close the doors, and extinguish the lamps. For Satan does not loosen the water skin, does not open the door, and does not uncover the vessels. I read that sentence slowly. Then I set the document down. Then I picked it up and read it again. This is a 7th century prophetic instruction. It emerged in a tradition that developed 15 centuries after the historical Solomon and 6 centuries after the final compilation of the Babylonian Talmud, a tradition that, in its formative period, had limited direct access to Talmudic scholarship. A tradition working from different revelation, different sources, a different time, a different geography, and it was describing the identical behavior. Cover the vessels, specifically the water containers, the water skins, because if you don't, they are open, and something uses that opening. The same theology, the same nighttime behavior, the same rationale expressed in the same direction. 2 witnesses. But I need to tell you something about what that moment actually felt like, because it was not the triumphant discovery moment you might picture. What I felt was something closer to dread. If both witnesses were correct, if this instruction had survived independently in 2 traditions across 15 centuries, both pointing to the same spiritual reality, then I had been wrong about my mother for the better part of 3 decades. And she was dead. And I could not tell her. I stayed with that for a long time before I kept reading. The 3rd witness came from a folder on my laptop I had not opened in years. My mother was from Nsukka, Igbo land, southeast Nigeria. Over my career, I had developed a careful professional practice around using African traditional knowledge as academic source material. The methodological risks are real. The risk of exoticizing, of treating a living tradition as data, of taking something alive and pinning it to a board in order to examine it. So I had kept my field notes from Nigeria visits in a separate folder. Not hidden, just unintegrated, held at arm's length by the same instinct that had always kept me from looking too directly at what my mother knew. That evening, after the Sahih Muslim passage, I opened the folder. There was a transcript from a conversation I had in Nsukka in 2006, 5 years before my mother died, with her father's sister, a woman of formidable presence, probably in her late 80s at the time. We talked for nearly 3 hours. I had specifically asked her about the water, not because I was looking for the Solomonic thread. I had no idea about any of that yet. I was just a son trying to understand his mother. The old woman told me, "Water is where the night things rest. The things that come at night, they do not come through walls. They come through openings, through thresholds, through cracks, through anything left open when the dark comes. And water is a special kind of opening. Water is a surface that faces 2 directions at once. When you leave it uncovered at night, you are leaving a door open that faces the other side." She said, "Your mother knew this because her mother knew it, and her mother's mother knew it, back and back as far as the tradition goes." I asked, "What does covering it do?" She said, "It seals the door." Then she said something else that I had written down, but not really heard until I read it again 6 years later, sitting with the Talmudic and Islamic material in front of me. She said, "Your mother didn't just cover the water, she declared it closed. The covering without the declaration is like a lock without a key turned. You have to say that it's closed. The door only seals when the person with authority over the house says it seals." I had written that down in 2006 as a point of ethnographic interest, a description of how the tradition understood the intention behind the ritual. In 2017, after Bava Kamma and after Sahih Muslim, I read it as theology. The Talmudic covering instruction is not just a physical act. The rabbis who encoded it in law understood the intention as inseparable from the action. Solomon didn't just put lids on containers, he asserted authority over the spirit realm through an act of deliberate sealing. The Islamic instruction is the same. It's a command to close, accompanied by the understanding that the closing has spiritual efficacy because it is done intentionally, with knowledge of what is being closed. The Igbo grandmother understood this. Her instruction to my mother wasn't just to cover the water, it was to declare it sealed, to make the assertion of authority explicit. And my mother made that assertion every night in whatever words she had been taught while I stood in the doorway being embarrassed on her behalf. Seal. I sat with that word for a long time. The Testament of Solomon, a Greek manuscript from roughly the 1st through 3rd century of the Common Era, preserving genuine Solomonic traditions through a pseudepigraphical frame, documents Solomon's method for dealing with water spirits directly. Kunopegos, a demon in the form of a seahorse that inhabits water and causes havoc. Enepsigos, a moon spirit connected to liquid elements. Solomon's containment method, sealed brass vessels, the opening bound by his ring. The theology is explicit and structural. A sealed container is a barrier. An open one is an access point. This is not incidental detail in the text. It is the working principle that the whole system runs on. Solomonic theology of sealing. Talmudic legal code requiring covered water at night. Prophetic instruction commanding vessels to be covered before sleep. An Igbo grandmother in Nsukka explaining that open water is a door that faces 2 directions, 3 written traditions, and a living African one, all arriving at the same instruction with the same rationale across 15 centuries and 4 civilizations. And that is when I understood what convergence actually means. This is not 4 groups of people who all independently arrived at the same hygiene habit. Coincidences don't work like that. Not across 15 centuries, not across 4 civilizations, not with this level of theological specificity about why the covering matters and what it does. What you are looking at when traditions this different preserve the same protective behavior with the same spiritual logic is the survival of a primary source. The rivers are different. The source is one. Solomon was the source. The Talmudic rabbis knew this because they were the direct custodians of Solomonic wisdom. Gittin 68 is essentially the recorded architecture of Solomon's spirit management system, and the household covering instruction flows directly from that architecture. The prophetic tradition received it through revelation, arriving independently at instructions that the Solomonic tradition had established 15 centuries earlier. The Yoruba and Igbo and Congolese and Ibibio and Efik traditions, all of which treat open water at night as a spirit gateway, all of which have their grandmothers covering the containers, kept the practice alive in the one form that cannot be erased by the burning of libraries or the suppression of texts. The living transmission, mother to daughter, and Nsukka to London to Oxford. My mother was not doing Nigerian hygiene anxiety. She was practicing Solomonic protective theology. She carried the manuscripts in her hands every night. She just hadn't read them. And I need to tell you the cost of understanding that. There is a specific kind of grief that doesn't have a clean name in English. It is not regret exactly, though it contains regret. It is not shame exactly, though shame is near it. It is the grief of understanding something too late to do anything with the understanding. Too late to give it to the person it would have mattered most to give it to. My mother is buried in Nsukka. I spoke at her funeral in 2011. I talked about her faith and her warmth and the particular way she had of making you feel held even when she was far away. I did not talk about the water. I didn't understand it yet. For most of my adult life, certainly from my SOS years onward, certainly through my Oxford career, I had positioned myself at a comfortable distance from what my mother practiced. I was the scholar. She was the believer. I understood the traditions she drew from without sharing the certainty she brought to them. That distance felt like intellectual integrity, like I was holding the material honestly, without the distortion of personal investment. What I did not understand, what this research made impossible to continue not understanding, is that the distance was not integrity. It was fear. I was afraid to take seriously what she knew, because taking it seriously meant something specific and uncomfortable. It meant that the epistemological framework I had spent my career carefully constructing, the controlled separation of the academic from the devotional, the historical from the supernatural, the text from the living practice, was not wrong but incomplete. And the part that was missing was precisely the part my mother had, the part she moved through every night with a quiet certainty that needed no validation from any archive. Now I walk through my house at night, past a glass left on the counter, a pot still in the sink, an uncovered container in the corner of the bathroom, and I feel it. Not as fear, as something that doesn't have a comfortable name. Something like the awareness of a door left open when doors should be closed. The specific wrongness of an access point that is still accessible, in the hours when it should be sealed. I cover them now. And when I cover them, I say something. Low, under my breath. I am still learning the right words, still finding the exact shape of the intention. But I say something, because I understand now that the murmuring was never incidental to my mother's ritual. The murmuring was the seal. The covering was the physical act. The words were the authority asserted over the opening. I cannot be the objective observer anymore. That comfortable distance is gone. My mother took it with her when she died, and I didn't notice it was gone until I found her practice in a reading room of the British Museum, encoded in a tractate of the Babylonian Talmud, in a language she never learned, in an archive she never visited. I owe her an apology she will never hear. That is the price. Not the knowledge itself. The knowledge is what I needed. The knowledge is good. The price is that it arrived 15 years too late for me to look at her across the kitchen and say, "The manuscripts say so. You were right. Solomon knew this, and somehow, through your mother and her mother and hers, you knew what Solomon knew. There is one more detail I want to come back to. At the beginning of this, I told you my mother murmured something when she covered the containers, that I was never close enough to make out the words. That I didn't ask. After I finished this research, I called my mother's older sister, the only one still living who knew my mother as a young woman in Nasuka. Before my father, before London, before any of the life I shared with her. I asked, "When Mama covered the water at night, what was she saying?" There was a pause, not the pause of uncertainty, the pause of someone deciding how much to give you. She said she was sealing them. She learned it from their mother, what she said, and she gave me the Igbo, which I will not try to reproduce here with the fidelity it deserves, was something close to. Nothing that wishes us harm passes through here. This vessel is closed. This house is sealed. A seal. In Solomon's protective system, in the technical sense of the Solomonic manuscript tradition, not as metaphor, a seal is not a symbol. A seal is a statement of authority asserted over an opening. When Solomon sealed a vessel with his ring, he was not performing a ritual gesture for its aesthetic value. He was declaring authority over the access point, asserting, "This opening is closed." By whose authority? By the authority of the one who built the temple, who commanded the spirits of the air and the waters, who had been given dominion over the seen and unseen worlds. There is one more thread I want to pull here, because I think it is important. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the oldest continuous Christian tradition in Africa, the one that claims its direct spiritual lineage from Solomon through Menelik I, son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, has preserved the practice of Tebel, holy water blessed by priests and used to seal homes, to protect families, to mark and close the household against spiritual harm. Ethiopian priests visit homes and bless the water within them. The water is used for exorcism, for healing, for protection. It is sealed, consecrated, declared spiritually closed. This is not a medieval European addition to Christian practice. The Ethiopian Orthodox tradition is older than the church councils that shaped Western Christianity. And at its heart, it carries a theology of water as something that can be either an open vulnerability or a sealed protection, depending on whether the authority of the covenant has been asserted over it. Menelik I carried the Ark of the Covenant from Jerusalem to Ethiopia. With it came, according to the Kebra Nagast, the Ethiopian text that documents this tradition, the wisdom of Solomon, the protective theology, the understanding of how the spirit realm operates, what opens it to harm, and what seals it against harm. The Ethiopian tradition preserved what the Western Church eventually lost, that water, in the household context, is not neutral. It is either sealed or it is open. And the difference between those two things is not physical, it is spiritual authority intentionally asserted. My mother did not have Solomon's ring, but she had his theology in her hands, and every night, for the 43 years I watched her do it, she was asserting, "Nothing that wishes us harm passes through here. This vessel is closed. This house is sealed." I came to this research as an academic, as the son of a UCL professor of ancient religions, trained at SOAS, working from manuscripts, maintaining the careful distance I had been taught was the mark of serious scholarship. I am leaving it as the student who finally understood what his teacher was doing. The 12-year-old who was embarrassed in that kitchen in Nasuka was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Comprehensively wrong. In the way that you can only be comprehensively wrong when you mistake a credential for wisdom, when you confuse the ability to read the map with knowledge of the terrain. My mother knew the terrain. Here is what I want you to take from this. Cover the water tonight. Every cup, every glass, every pot, every bucket, every vessel of water in your home. Before you sleep. Not because of this video, not because of me, because the Talmud says to, because the Hadith says to, because the Igbo grandmother and the Yoruba elder and the Afik tradition and the Congolese practice and the Ethiopian Orthodox priest blessing your home with tebel, the consecrated holy water that is the living expression of Solomonic water protection theology, traced directly back through Menelik I, son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. All say to, because Solomon commanded it first, and when you cover them. This is the part most people will skip, but I want you to stay with it. Don't cover them as though you're putting a lid on a cup. Cover them as an act of sealing. Say something when you do, even if you don't have the words yet, even if it's only this. Nothing that wishes me harm passes through here. This vessel is closed. This house is sealed. Say it with the authority of someone who has every right to declare that about their own home. Because you do. And then go to sleep. I'll say one more thing, and then I'll let you go. My mother's practice. The one I called Nigerian hygiene anxiety. The one I let my father's framing replace my own observation. Survives in manuscripts I can read in 4 languages, in archives on 3 continents. The Talmud preserves it in civil law. The Testament of Solomon preserves it in demonology. The Hadith preserves it as prophetic command. The grandmothers of West and Central Africa preserved it in practice, in the one form that doesn't require a library. The form of something a mother does every night before bed, murmuring something her children will only understand decades later, in a reading room, in a foreign city, holding a scan of a manuscript that is 800 years old. I wonder how many other practices there are, the ones we inherited from our grandmothers and called superstition, the ones we slowly let drift away because we were too modern, too educated, too eager to separate ourselves from what we didn't yet understand. I wonder how many of them are also there. In the archives, in the manuscripts, in the traditions that never stopped transmitting them because the grandmothers never stopped. That question is going to take me a while to answer. I plan to try. If you've stayed with me this far, you've just watched me work through something that took 3 months and a considerable amount of expensive archive time to reach, and you did it in about 15 minutes. That matters to me more than I can easily say in a YouTube call to action. This kind of research, working through the Talmudic sources, tracking the Solomonic manuscript tradition across 4 civilizations, finding the convergence, takes time to do properly. Time I can only protect because there are people who value what it produces. If this video gave you something real, a new framework for understanding your grandmother's knowledge, a connection between ancestral practice and the oldest texts in the world, a moment where something shifted, and if you want to support that work directly, super thanks is how you do it. It's also how you tell me this kind of depth is worth the time it requires. Tell me something in the comments. What did your grandmother do? Before bed, in the kitchen, moving through the house? That you were too modern to take seriously? I'm asking genuinely, not rhetorically, because I think the manuscripts are full of things that living grandmothers never stopped practicing, and I want to know which ones you're carrying. Or write the word sealed if this changed how you see your grandmother's knowledge. I read everyone.